Dissent at its barest minimum is objection. It's also about difference. So it isn't just about a negation or a rejection, it's also about having an alternative. What was wonderful was that when I first got to meet everyone at the chapel in Andover, it was February of 2015, and Peter Driver drove me from the Winchester campus out to the Chapel Arts Studio in Andover, which, for those of you that don't know, is located in the middle of a cemetery in this deconsecrated chapel. So it does what it says on the tin. It's Chapel Arts Studio. And at the time, it was an artist studio and a set of offices. So when I met everyone was very warm and friendly, and we had no agenda. We wanted to know what everyone was working on and what we might do together. So it was a really open discussion. And what was brilliant and this lovely moment of serendipity was that Chapel Arts associated artists started talking about this interest in dissent and looking at the fact that the chapel was originally a dissenters' chapel and thinking about what that might mean creatively and how you might link to that heritage in this kind of open-ended way, which again, remember, is very early 2015. It is a somewhat different political landscape from the one that we have now, and one in which we couldn't have anticipated yet what was down the road in what now seems like the near future, but at the time was just not imaginable. So when the question of dissent came up, I got really excited because I had been reading Jacques Rancière's De Sensus and Chantal Mouffe's book Agonistics. And what I was very interested in was this premise that rather than forcing consensus onto a society, what if you embrace this idea of the dissensual instead of the consensual, which doesn't mean about forcing, it's about having this embrace of diversity, about embracing the conflicting points of view, and rather than seeing that heading towards an antagonistic social situation, might it not lead towards an agonism, something where you have the tension of differing points of view? It doesn't lead towards some sort of violent clash. Instead, it forces you into this kind of dialectical push and pull and this give and take. So I thought, theoretically I was already really interested in this, and here seemed to be a group of people wanting to make some kind of practical testing ground of very similar ideas. And eventually, the conversation came to this notion of dissent as a working methodology. What would it mean to explore dissent as a working methodology creatively with an artist collective? So we decided that we would work together on a project. We still didn't know what it was going to be. We knew it would take place in the late summer of 2015. So we had several generative group meetings and conversations, and I know that Cass used Basecamp to do a lot of the internal communication preparing for this project. And in my recollection, the really important and exciting meeting was in June of 2015 here at the WSA campus in the cafe, because that's when we started to get to the nitty-gritty of, well, what is it that we're going to do? What are we going to call this? How can you test this notion that we have about dissent? And what's this actually going to mean on a practical level? And through the conversation and the give and take, what was decided together was an idea that it was like a gallery takeover. It was going to be a series of mini residencies that would culminate in a group something. So what we ended up structuring was the notion that across 5 weeks, you would have the associate artists membership. You would see who wanted to participate, so then that would be a slightly smaller number, and then you would divide that into 4 equal groups, or cells. And each one would receive a 1-week residency in the gallery, in the Winchester Gallery. And then the 5th week would see all of those 4 weeks, those groups would bring elements from their week's work together into an accumulated exhibition and a 2-day symposium. And the public would be invited to that symposium as well. The public were also invited to engage in a variety of ways with each of those mini residencies across those other 4 weeks. But really, the big kind of public interaction would come in that cumulative event at the end. The notion was that there would be some set rules about how the weeks needed to have a structure and what each of the groups were going to do in terms of taking over the space and then handing over the space to the next group. And the notion behind having the rules was you have to have something against which one might dissent. So we always knew there was the potential for interesting and unplanned deviations from the rules, because we expected and certainly received a lot of provocations and kind of anything from japes to genuine, like, kind of clashes of interactions. The Chapel Art Studio artists had begun reading texts by Chantal Mouffe in particular, and we're having guided kind of seminar reading groups where they were unpacking some of these questions around dissent and around how one might move towards this agonistic situation rather than an antagonist situation with dissent. And within this one essay in particular, there were really productive, creatively productive subheadings to the essay. And in the end, the decision was that each of the week's groups would take one of those subheadings as its thematic, so its sub-theme that would connect to this umbrella theme of the laboratory of dissent. So rather tongue-in-cheek, we had made this decision that we were going to pursue this idea of the trope of the experiment. So like one group even thought of having white lab coats, and if we're going to test this notion of the workability of dissent as a methodology, let's properly embrace the notion of the laboratory. So that's how we hit the title, Laboratory of Dissent, and then each week had a sub-theme under that umbrella of the Laboratory of Dissent. And what was really apparent to me at the very start in this June session was that already I was going to be forced into a weird position because I really wanted this project. I was excited about it. I'd commissioned it, and yet institutionally I was going to be having to wear some hats that maybe I didn't want to wear, where I was going to have to make sure that the laboratory didn't create dissent that was somehow detrimental to the infrastructure or reputation of the university and the gallery. So I then had to kind of, on health and safety grounds or institutional reputational grounds, suddenly wear this kind of quasi-authoritarian hat where I'd have to make executive decisions and sometimes say, no, that proposal, like, you can't do that element of it. That's too provocative or too confusing. And I had to kind of wear more of a curatorial hat about how might an innocent audience get involved. Like, let me give you an example. So one of the propositions was for a week to look at institutional critique around galleries, but specifically the function and use of this gallery as part of an educational facility, but also as an exhibiting space, and like how do we contract artists? How do we support shows? Is it worthwhile having this space as a gallery space? Should the gallery be auctioned off? And to what end, et cetera, et cetera. And there were some really clever and funny kind of pop art, situationist type strategies and proposals made about how this might proceed as a performance. But I needed to think about the fact that we have a really high pedestrian footfall and traffic going past the gallery because we are on Park Avenue and it leads up to the leisure center and a primary school. And we have lots of people in the community who kind of take us for granted as a wallpaper. And one of the things we've been trying to do is grow the, not the brand recognition, that's totally the wrong expression here, but just to get people more aware that we're here as a public offering and that they are welcome to come and see our shows, and to get them to recognize that we're here not just as a university resource for staff and students, but as a community resource. So I needed to think really carefully about how an audience might be hailed by whatever was going to be staged here during this laboratory of dissent. And I wanted to make sure that the messages we were sending weren't going to be counterproductive to the larger community aims I had been trying to develop for the gallery, and the potential for our outreach, and how our kind of neo-Dadaist provocations might get misinterpreted. So I had to suddenly wear this kind of boring institutional hat that was thinking about these more mundane and yet very important elements to my work as the gallery director and as the host for this project. So I think that was something I started to become aware of in our meeting in June, that became even more intensified during the 5 weeks of the project. So for me, that was an interesting thing that I'll come back to in a little bit when we're talking a bit more about some of the realizations that were developed from the project. Mm. But the series of residencies led to 4 very different and distinct projects that you could see the line that ran through them and how they connected to the Laboratory of Dissent, but they each had a highly individual identity. And then, for me, the richest and best part was that final week where we brought all those strands together. Because that's the whole idea, is the question around dissent and around dissensus isn't just about having these different points of view. It is about how do you bring those together in tension, and how can you sort of circle around them, and then it's about where you go from there. So it isn't just about things having these kind of points of contestation. It's about what can that then lead towards. Mm. So I hope that answered that question, which I can no longer remember what the question was. So what happened in the Laboratory of Dissent is that after all of the generative work we had collaborated on, we came to the point of, okay, we're launching. So we had the 4 weeks, I think it was like, I can't remember the exact dates, but it was once we were into August of 2015, we had 4 weeks, and then a 5th week that was definitely in sort of mid-September as the academic year, the next academic year was starting to launch, where we had our accumulated exhibition and 2-day symposium. So what happened was we had week 1, a group came and had an empty gallery, and they began setting up the gallery to look like a marketing focus group company building. And they adopted the trope of the kind of office aesthetic and the use of Post-it notes and how you might have like a mind map, or you might have a multi-tiered to-do list. So imagine it's kind of like half marketing advertising firm and half software engineers and coders. And they began soliciting interviews from staff. We didn't have many students around. A few master's degree art students would have been preparing for their degree show, because we didn't yet have the contemporary curation master's program running yet. And they would ask them, quite potentially contentious questions about, what do you think about the gallery and about how it's programmed and what it shows and how would you want it to be different. And then they would, with their consent, publicize and post online and in the gallery space the responses that they were receiving. They wanted to do an interview with me about these questions to do with the gallery and its functioning and its structure, and so we did that. And then they provided me with the written transcript for my input, and I did track changes to say, like, here are some corrections where I think you didn't quite get what I was saying, or here's even like spell checking, or it would be better grammatically to fix it like this. And then of course I come in the next day and there's a wall that's completely fly pasted with the printed out sheets of that edited transcript. So then you can see not just their transcription of the interview with me, but where I've attempted to make my dissenting opinion and my not interference, but my attempt to edit that was then laid bare and made transparent. So within all the workings of week 1, it was very much about trying to take the invisible structures and functions within an institution and lay them bare and expose them and start to interrogate what those workings mean and how they have a currency and a real world implication. And so to take the kind of infrastructure of an arts institution and expose that and explore what it means and what's significant about it. Now, one of the things that was really interesting was the groups were meant to have a means by which they could take over the space at the start of a week, do whatever it was that they wanted to do with their sub-theme, and because it was open to the public, but it was really like a studio process. So it was a takeover, the residency was a takeover of the space. The space didn't need to be a traditional exhibition space. It could be a kind of incubator, it could be a working space, it could be a studio. But there was a notion about that it should be effectively neutral as a space when that week would receive it, and then they should tidy up and leave it in that same fashion for the next week's group. And there would even be a kind of meeting and a handover that was almost ceremonial or ritual in its process between each of the groups, like a baton handoff between the weeks of residencies. The second week's group was composed of artists who realized they were all women who were immigrants to Britain and also mothers. And they decided that they wanted to look at the subsection of the Chantal Mouffe essay that looked at, quote, domesticating conflict. And they wanted to explore that intersection of identities between being migrants, mothers, and artists. So this was in August of 2015 with the mounting and compounding of the refugee crisis in Calais and the tent city that was exploding there in Calais. So one of the artists from week 2 is French and has, as a part of her artistic oeuvre, this performance of this stereotypical French artist. So this is this persona that she plays, and under the guise of that persona, she had decided she wanted to occupy the gallery across the weeks of the project, and she spoke to me about this, and I could understand very much where this was coming within the spirit of the project, so I agreed to assist her and collaborate in all senses with her provocation. So when the people came for week 1, she had already arrived before them, or possibly it was actually the end of day 1, so that it was when they came in for day 2 this had happened. But she had occupied a corner of the gallery with this tent and placards, and there were significant kind of shamanistic objects tied to her performative persona that were also left in the tent. And it was this occupation that she had included as a provocation. So week 1 had their feathers very much ruffled by this unexpected development. That was a divergence, a dissent from the agreed rules of engagement for this project. So then week 2, like I say, was about domesticating conflict. And the group who came, they did a range of installations and performances, and it was really interesting, and it grew across the space of the week, what they built and made, and how it all intersected. It was, for me, because it directly engaged a range of my research interests through feminist art art history and theory, it was one of the richest parts of the project for me personally. They also did an interview with me, which they then published online. It was at some point early in week 2 that I suddenly went, oh my goodness, what am I thinking? Why have I not been documenting all of this? Because I realized I had been, in this kind of half-hearted, ad hoc way, I'd been taking photos personally on my phone, but I hadn't been doing anything with them, and I hadn't been offering any sort of commentary or archiving of any of this. And I think it's very hard to explain for people who weren't participating in this what the pace of all of this was like. This was something that we had set up as a genuine research opportunity. We did not know what the outcomes would be. Sometimes we did not know what the practical details were going to involve until they evolved on the spot. And once we kind of started the timer, as it were, on the project, everything happened at a really breakneck speed. It was a very intensive period of time. So also my office is in the gallery, and I had other institutional operations that I needed to be in the office performing during this time, as well as working with Cass on the realization of this live project. So it meant I was physically here and trying to get stuff done, and this was happening. So it was really intense. And suddenly at the beginning of week 2, I thought, my goodness, I need to somehow directly engage with what's happening and how I intersect with it. So I started a Tumblr blog. Remember, it's 2015. So I started a Tumblr blog posting, retrospectively posting the pictures I had taken of week 1 and putting together some very brief captions and commentary for week 1. Then starting to live update the pictures as they grew from week 2 with commentary and reflections and like transcribing texts that I thought were appropriate to what we were engaged with, and that offered some kind of helpful guide into the critical things we were learning through the project. So then I maintained that kind of live blogging aspect throughout the remainder of the project. So then the nice thing was at the end there was this Tumblr blog which was very visual and was an archive of what we had made together from my point of view. So obviously at the same time, Cass had an extensive online presence through both their website and blogs that they set up, and other Tumblr blogs that they set up for each of the weeks. So yeah, there was a lot of interesting divergent online presence for the project. So when week 2 finished, week 3 was going to come in with the theme of are we in or out? Now what was interesting was again the provocatrice, I guess she would be, Laurence. She had her tent again in a different part of the gallery, and she scared the life out of the artist who was coming from week 3 to start that process because she was physically occupying her tent. he didn't know for like a good hour or 2. It was amazing. Until she then revealed herself. He thought he was alone in here setting up. Anyway, what was nice about this was that there was a jocular element to this. We were dealing with really serious themes. We had really serious reasons for wanting to undertake the project, but there was a great joie de vivre about it all. There was a joyfulness, which I think just comes with working with Chapel Art Studios. It's a lovely group of people in this artist collective, and they all have a seriousness of intent, but a wonderful, wicked sense of humor as well. So that was in total evidence. This Are We In or Are We Out group had a very different aesthetic, and it was a very minimalist aesthetic, and it was again about creating this kind of strangeness to the space. What was the space meant to be read as? Was it an office? Was it a performance? Was it an incubator? You know, what was was it like some kind of journalism workshop? What was it? And there were performance elements, there were graphic design production elements that grew each day. but really it was looking at where we were at that time. Yes, we're having the migrant crisis. That's starting to indicate certain things politically and practically for Europe. But we were also at that point aware of the potential for the Scottish referendum. And there was no way in which anyone foresaw Brexit or Trump or any of this. And however, this thematic was already on the horizon about this idea of belonging, of union, of societal formation that was really crucial to this are we in or are we out, and this notion of where dissent puts you within that sense of belonging. And does that make you excluded from the community, or can there be this dissensual community where the outsider point of view still resides within that social connection? So I think it was one of the more serious-minded of the weeks, and it had a real intensity to it. But again, there was like a lightness and a charm to the way it came together. And there were some really beautiful poetical elements to that week. I think what was lovely is that each of the weeks had a very distinct tone, feel, and aesthetic. So if you're just looking at it from an artistic point of view, what was beautiful was the diversity of artistic approach that was very evident across the project as well. So then in week 4, what happened was we had a very playful takeover, even kind of more overt takeover of the gallery space. And this was the group that David Dixon was in, Peter Driver and Helen Northcott, and they created this interactive, like lo-fi, sci-fi, dystopian, interactive game space. It's like an escape room before escape rooms existed in the gallery. So there were all of these, this hanging sheeting, plastic sheeting material, creating this labyrinth through the gallery. Helen Northcott had made these kind of like Blake Seven, Doctor Who, talking heads, psychedelic colored videos that played on TV screens, and she would give you the instructions for what you should be doing as you maneuvered through this play space. And there were all these slogans and logos, and the notion was that it's this near future dystopian authoritarian society, and you as a citizen of this world are forced into these really awful scenarios. And you had to decide how you were going to ethically navigate this. Were you going to consent, and were you going to submit, or were you going to dissent and rebel? And what would be the consequences of this? And structurally, the way that they designed this, there were certain kind of meta lessons that you could take away from the results of how you chose to engage with the game. So it was playful, it was fun, but it was very ominous at the same time. And I think people really enjoyed the kind of wackiness of that one also. So when we came into our 5th week, each of those weeks of mini residencies, each of those groups were invited to select emblematic elements of what they had displayed or created, exhibited in the gallery across their residencies, and put together this assembled, accumulated exhibition. And so it was, I think it worked really well. It was a really nice way that this was zoned out. And so you could get a flavor, a little taster of each of those weeks. So had you not been here for all of it, you'd still have a fairly good visual and atmospheric indication of what those weeks had been like. And then there was a 2-day symposium, and members from each of the groups presented about their week's residency and what they learned. And it was a really interesting 2-day symposium. It was very well attended. We had very colorful, huge, big bean bags for people to recline on. So it had it kind of maintained that fun carnival element to the project. Again, Laurence did her final provocation, and she spoke to me and said, right, for day 2 of the symposium, I want to have everyone arrive to discover that the gallery has been seemingly cordoned off externally with, like, you know, red and white danger tape, and I'll have these hazardous materials warning signs that say warning cross-contamination, site's been cross-contaminated, which of course was a beautiful play on the fact that all the groups were mingling for this final compiled and aggregated exhibition and symposium. So again, her humor, but also this notion of this kind of fearfulness came back into play. So I thought that was lovely, and she did that very successfully. And it did elicit lots of chuckles from people when they arrived for the second day. So I think that what was hugely successful was the fact that everyone had maintained their stamina in what proved to be a really tiring 5-week cycle. They maintained the momentum of the idea and continued to push it in a number of directions and interrogate it seriously, but with a good, wry sense of humor attached to it, that kind of gallows humor that you need when you're dealing with really difficult geopolitical issues, but also within the safety net, as it were, of artistic exploration. So we reached the end of the 2-day symposium, which was also the end of the exhibition, and we had to pack everything away. And I continued to document that for the Tumblr blog as well. So we got to, you know, the last picture is the sort of locking up the door. It was exhausting, and I had to go away and like have a long rest. And really, it took ages to digest properly what we had experienced. And I think this was the crucial, really important element of this project and why we are at the start of 2.0 for Laboratory of Dissent. It was, in a really healthy way, indigestible. There was an element within the project that continued to have vibrant currency that didn't diminish, that didn't just cycle through you. There was a residue from this project that I think has become actually stronger and intensified because we had stumbled onto something crucial for our contemporary moment. So when we hit 2016, and we are in the US presidential election cycle, a friend was saying to me, "Oh, grief, what do you think about this idea that Donald Trump has thrown his hat into the ring?" This is a British friend here at WSA. And I scoffed and said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. You needn't worry at all. Don't even pay any attention to this vanity project of running for president. It's a stunt. It's never going to go anywhere. He won't even make it to be a serious contender in the GOP primaries." And we wagered a pint of beer on this. And then to my horror, not only was he still in the game at the time of the Republicans getting ready for their primary and for naming their candidate, you know, then he secured their nomination and he became the official Republican candidate for president. I then still was like, there's no way that this man is going to succeed, and especially once the presidential debates began, and once it became just, you know, it was him and it was Hillary, and it was so obvious that this man was completely unlike anything we'd seen before, and he was a laughingstock, he was a bully. There was no way this was going anywhere. Then, of course, pardon me, Pussygate happens, and this horrible, you know, vintage recording of him talking about his handling of women. You're thinking, there's no way now that this is going to happen. Okay, then of course, immediately, suddenly we get this WikiLeaks about Hillary's emails being an issue again, and just the tide turned, literally in those last 2 weeks. So when we get to early November 2016, the unthinkable happens. We wake up on the morning of, what was it, like the 9th of November, and this man has been elected the president, and we just couldn't believe it. But equally, earlier in the summer of 2016, in June, especially in Winchester, which has got a really interesting demographic, I just didn't even think that there was anything to be worried about with this Brexit vote. I really genuinely thought it'll give people a chance to air their Eurosceptic points of view, and I can imagine the Leave campaign getting a healthy turnout at the polls, but I really expected it would be something like 2/3 to 1/3, 2/3 being Remain, and it would be a non-issue, it would be a non-starter. And it was just a blip. So when, again, we woke up on the 23rd, 24th of June, whichever it was, to discover that in point of fact, yep, it was really, really close, but in a kind of 48-52 split, the vote had been for Brexit. It was really, again, just such an unexpected result. You couldn't quite digest that either. And I think because in both of these cases, you look at the US election, and Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but because of the nature of our structure with the Electoral College and how it casts votes and the way in which that is apportioned, Donald Trump won the Electoral College votes, so therefore he won the election. And then you look at Brexit and you look at this incredibly close result about this versus this. This notion of what do you do when you have these incredibly divisive referenda, and you have to go and you have to stake your claim and you have to nail your colors to the mast. And if it becomes that polarized, what do you do next? You're still living together in the same country, but where you are directing that country to go is seemingly positive for one group and highly upsetting and contentious for another. What do you do with those very polarized points of view? What do you do with the group that is dissenting from the direction the nation is being steered into? And how do you continue to live together? How do you continue to recognize that we are all still neighbors, colleagues, citizens, family members? These are incredibly explosive and divisive moments because it cuts to the core of our sense of identity, our sense of ethics, our ideas about how we should direct resources in our life, in our society, in our tribe, and how we identify, how we affiliate as collectives, as groups. Is this going to be something that will fundamentally splinter us? Will it cause us to have even more factionalism? So these are hugely important real-world questions that we had almost flippantly stumbled upon when we started down this road of exploring dissent. And I think it will continue to become an incredibly important question that cuts across the really mundane, everyday interactions that we have and the incredibly important, rarefied issues that we all care about. So that's why there seems to be this indigestible currency within the project, because it continues to have this incredibly vital connection and resonance with the micro and the macro across the board in our daily lives.
Yeah. What is it about dissent as a methodology or as something that you're going to actively encourage and engage with that is useful or it's sort of the resonance and relevance thing, but all of that stuff that you just said about the political context, what did we learn about dissent in version 1 that illuminated itself as actually this is really useful?
Yeah, I think what was so important about dissent as we learned about it in version 1 of Laboratory of Dissent is this direct resonance that it has when we are living in a world that's constantly telling you you have to like cut loose your personal commitments in order to reach this this compromise that's being forced upon us. And the example I keep thinking about are the protests that are happening right now in Hong Kong, and the way in which, I mean, if you set aside kind of all the particulars of it, it's just an example where you have a space where people felt that they had the ability to have more dissenting points of view, and they could pursue more options than increasingly they feel is possible because of the authoritarian governmental structures imposed from mainland China. So that, for me, if you look at what's going on in the States right now, you have a very polarized nation with someone who's incredibly divisive at the top, but who is trying constantly to force very restrictive top-down structures onto every element of society that really impacts your daily life. So it isn't just about a kind of policy platform that, you know, you're going to go to the polls and sort of say this or that, but it will really track down into the minutiae of the texture of your daily life. It's going to impact what is and isn't possible for you. What I think was so important about exploring dissent and as you say, inviting dissent, is literally that. The fact that rather than trying to constantly force people down this one avenue, we're inviting people to dissent. What this means is sometimes a bit chaotic. And if you're somebody who, you know, has this executive mindset and envisions this very top-down structure, you are not going to invite dissent. If, however, what you're really interested in is diversity flourishing,
creativity,
you're going to invite dissent. Because, good gracious, life becomes incredibly monocultural and boring and dull and colorless if you continually just cycle the same air over and over again. If you don't have that plurality coming in chaotically, you don't have regenerative experiences, because there's nothing there. It's like, here's a terrible analogy, it's like gut bacteria. You know, if that becomes too monocultural, you're going to quickly see some really revolting, terrible outcomes, literal outcomes. However, if you've got this like wonderful diversity of gut flora, you're going to flourish as a body. And I think that, I mean, it's a candid analogy, but it's also rather apt when you think about the body politic. If you continue to have and invite a wide range of opinions, yeah, it's going to be chaotic. Sometimes it's going to be super unsafe. Sometimes you're going to have to rethink certain things. But it means that you're all in it together. And it means that you have to become more aware and self-critical about, are you someone who's being privileged by the status quo? Have you become comfortable in your assumptions? Do you not have introspection because you don't need it, because you're actually doing fine by the current situation? Or are you somebody who's been constantly undervalued or disadvantaged by the situation? This might be your chance to rectify things. You know, you've got to invite everyone to the table. And that's what encouraging dissent does. It opens the door to the messy, the difficult, but the thing that's possibly going to save us.
We also learned a lot about collaboration, didn't we, professionally? There was, you know, what it takes to get things done and get agreement or renegotiation or space or...
Yeah, so I think the question around dissent and collaboration or collectivity, and it comes back to this question of how do you structure and organize a body towards decision making, because you don't want this to just be a talking shop. You know, at the end of the day, we had things we needed to make and do, and I had to wear certain hats, and you guys wanted to wear certain hats, but also were forced to wear hats. I mean, there was a really interesting bit. I was reading one of the essays possibly that you wrote, someone wrote in Retrospect on version 1.0. And I think it was talking about Lydia and her paintbrushes, because she had these really lovely, valuable paintbrushes that had been left from week 1, and she was super worried about what week 2 was going to do in terms of possibly co-opting them and being provocative and might damage them or something. Because basically, I think Laurence was having an exchange with Lydia about the return of these brushes, and was being cheeky. And what was really interesting was in this bit that I was reading, Lydia was talking about, gosh, I got really personally anxious about this. It put my back up. I got possessive about them.
That was Laurence.
Was it Laurence?
Brushes.
Was it the other way around?
Yeah.
Okay, so Laurence was saying she was the one that was all stressed about. But anyway, what was so interesting was that this thing that you wouldn't have expected to A, be the provocative moment, or B, be that seemingly important, actually was this lovely encapsulation of what's at stake often in these encounters. But at the end of the day, you're still working towards something together. You have to find a way past those hurdles and past those moments of anxiety and of fearfulness and where questions of respect come up and of trust. I think what is so important is you do have to have some kind of agreement about how you're going to work together. So it's when you're exploring dissent as a working methodology, you still have to be working. There's still a method that you're using to work together. So we're not trying to do this as a talking shop. It's not just a thought exercise. We're trying to achieve something. We're exploring the question around flattened hierarchies, but it's not. I'm still the director of the gallery who's commissioned the piece, has institutional roles I have to fulfill. You guys still have ultimate aims and goals individually, collectively within each of the week's groups, but also together as the Associate Artists Program. What's been great is we've all parlayed this into something that has assisted us. I've spoken internationally about this project as a really interesting example of innovative curatorial practice. You guys have used this as a cornerstone for your application to the Arts Council, and you secured national portfolio status and funding. So it's had real world impact for us practically in a career way and in an artistic way. But it is about trying to make something. You are genuinely trying to do something. So you're finding it is hard, and it is this issue of negotiation. And how do you reach points where everyone can buy into effectively a consensus through dissensus, but then without it being artificial? And you're never going to please everybody. That's a part of what we're doing. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about, imagine a court trying to make a decision. Those justices may reach a majority opinion. It won't necessarily be a unanimous opinion, and you may have a dissenting opinion. The minority opinion produces their dissenting report. But they've still made a judgment, and they've still decided that that's done, it's in the books, and they move on to the next thing. So I think it's really interesting, and it's something I've always been curious about when, historically, I've looked at, for instance, when in the 60s you had artist collectives coming together in the States in response to kind of new left politics and looking at flattened hierarchies and how do you then work together as a committee who has certain goals and aims. How do you ever reach the decision? I mean, you can end up talking in circles for ages and ages and ages, and I'm sure you guys know this intimately. There's a beautiful bit in Mike Lee made a film about the Spanish Civil War, and it was the first time, that may have been the first Mike Lee film. No, I'd seen Secrets and Lies. I think this was like the second Mike Lee film I'd ever seen. But it was certainly his first like properly political one I'd seen. And what was super interesting was this bit, I'm now suddenly thinking, oh good grief, was it a Ken Loach film? Good Lord, it was one or the other. But it's about the Spanish Civil War. But there's this beautiful scene where it's showing the Republican fighters together in this like upstairs room of a pub. And they're having a debate about this. They need to make a decision about something they're going to do next. And they're wanting to have this kind of communal council opinion. but they have very different points of view in this room. And this scene goes on for, in my memory, like for ages, way beyond what you would expect normally cinematically. And it becomes fabulous and really engrossing. And you start to feel like you are in the meeting there and that you've got skin in the game. And, you know, this decision is going to be super important because it had enormous real world impact for those people historically. You know, in that moment, this was crucial. This was life and death stuff. And it was so interesting because it is about how do you eventually reach the decision? And when you're trying to be respectful of that plurality of point of view, and there's nobody who's outranking anybody else, how do you reach that decision? And again, when you look at Occupy, the Occupy movement, and so like, you know, let's go back almost a decade and look at the Occupy movement, this is something that they were, again, testing out in the real world in real time. How do you have these non-hierarchical, yet nonetheless executive committees? And how do you make decisions when you're in a really embattled position? You know, this stuff has major implications for the group, for the individuals, and for the aims and objectives that you're holding to. How do you reach those decisions? So I think this is why, again, we keep all being interested in further iterations of the laboratory of dissent, is because we don't know the answer to that. In as much as I could say we maybe know this answer, which is that it's on a case-by-case basis. Each time that you are engaged in these kinds of collectives, there are certain structural specifics that'll be a little bit different that will somehow be critical in how it performs. And so I think that's why we're so fascinated by it, because it's never always the same. And you're going to learn something a bit different each time.
What does Laboratory of Dissent 2.0 offer, inside outside?
What I think is really interesting is the inside outside is an extension to a degree of that week 3 from 1.0, the are we in or are we out, which, as we were talking about, has become even more crucial and important in terms of our divisive geopolitical moments, Brexit, border policing, etc. So that's really interesting, but it's also a nice response to the fact that we are in spaces that are very outward focused and outward facing. So we've got the screen that's in the foyer of LTC, the Lecture Theater C on campus, which that video screen plays to a huge wall of windows looking onto the street. We get enormous footfall and traffic of passers-by, so you're really on the inside, but definitely facing out. Again, the bottom of the rotunda, you know, it's a glass in the round, it's very outward facing. And the LTA foyer, the Lecture Theater A foyer, which is above the gallery where we are here, again, has enormous public footfall. So there's a lovely, very simple connection it also has to the architectural siting of the project. I think one of the strengths of Chapel Art Studios is that it's always very site-specific and responsive to the concept and the practicality of its setting. Whenever I've encountered projects that you guys have developed, it's always been very mindful of those different registers of meaning.
What are the challenges of this model of working?
My goodness, where to start? What are the challenges of this model of working? They are numerous. The reason why I'm drawn to this, but what makes it challenging, is that this working model means that you will constantly have to be responsive to on-the-spot changes, because it's something that you can set in motion in a general way, but you won't necessarily know how it's going to come together in the practical reactions and what that's going to necessitate as secondary steps. So for me, I think that's why the laboratory is a good indication of what it is, because it is experimental. It is genuinely experimental. We will often have planned aims and objectives. We'll have certain ways of engagement. So there'll be some sense of baseline rules for what we want to achieve and how we're going to set about that. but there will be so many unknown quantities. And so it just on a practical project management point of view, it's challenging to work that way because you can't relax into the project. You have to always be on your toes because there's always going to be some unexpected element that you didn't foresee. Even if you have thought this thing through seemingly thoroughly together, trying to look for all the little, bits and bobs that might go wrong. It's not that they go wrong, it's just that they're always going to be surprising. Because that's really what we're doing. This is what we were saying about before, about inviting dissent. You're inviting the unexpected, the unknown into the project, into the process. That's just the very nature of it. So you can try to foresee and plan for as many of the practical elements, but you're still never going to fully know what's going to come out of it. So there's a wonderful element of the unknown involved in it. That I think is probably the most challenging, but also the most rewarding. Because you have to be prepared to turn on a dime, and you don't know what is going to be required of you from moment to moment necessarily. Which is why
I also think the inside-outside theme being related to the inner experience and the outer experience. Absolutely. Because it's also very personal. Yeah. The moment of I dissent or I don't. Yeah, am absolutely. I in? Am I out?
Absolutely, definitely. And also, to a degree, you don't even know how you're going to react until you're faced with it. That's what I think has, for me, been one of the continuing elements of 1.0, is the way in which I continue to return to my experience of it when I'm dealing with little things and big things in my life, in my political life. Because we are changing and evolving all the time as people, as thinkers, as actors. But what's so interesting is the way in which it's the being in that moment and knowing that things are genuinely at stake. You don't necessarily know how you're going to react. You may have an intimation that you would roughly go this direction or that direction, but until it's really in front of you and you're feeling it because you're actually embodying that moment, you don't know how you're going to respond and how you're going to, are you going to consent or are you going to dissent? And if you are going to dissent, in what way and to what degree and to what end? It's super interesting.
So in a couple of weeks' time, you're moving on from the WSA and going to the States to become head of school. Do you have any last words for now for the cast artists?
I think what's so exciting about Chapel Art Studio, and the reason why I was just speaking about you guys again the other day to a chap in the States. What's so exciting is because you all are bringing very different points of view to the table, which is why this is a very natural seeming project for the organization to be engaged with. And I would say continue to embrace that diversity of points of view, of practices, of personalities, because it's what is bringing that richness to your culture, to your community. And it's hard, and I know sometimes this is not me having any knowledge, this is me extrapolating from what I know of working with others. Personalities are hard to navigate sometimes, especially when you have people who think differently. That's what's wonderful. You want people who have unusual points of view, but sometimes that makes it really hard to find how you do fit together and how can you all end up working and making a result. So even if you're not object-oriented and you're very process-focused, you've still probably got some kind of thing that you would like to see happen at the end of an effort. And so it's how do you continue to bring everyone together in a way that respects that diversity and yet can still create a collective result to your efforts. And it's hard, and I think it's worthwhile. So I would just say continue being you, all of you, in your unique ways, and hang in there and keep pushing for more and more ambitious projects because you're all capable of it, but also continue to do the dull hard work of circling back to reflect upon, to document, to archive and publicize and disseminate what you've already done, because your efforts are worthy of notice. They can offer examples for other collectives to learn from. The work that you're producing is having wonderful discoveries that have real world implications as well as artistic world implications. So keep doing what you're doing. It's great, and I look forward to working with you guys more.
Yay.